The flashing red and blue lights painted the front of my house like a circus I never bought a ticket to. 2 police cruisers idled at the curb, their engines rumbling over the sound of the night insects. A handful of neighbors peeked through half-drawn blinds, pretending they weren't watching but hungry for gossip. And there I stood, barefoot on my own driveway, facing 2 uniformed officers who had come to remove me from my property. "Sir," the taller officer said, hand resting near his holster, "the Homeowners Association filed a trespassing complaint. They claim you've been warned before." I blinked at him. "Warned before? Officer, I've lived here for 12 years." Behind him, 3 members of the HOA stood in a little cluster near the sidewalk, polo shirts, clipboards, smug smiles. The president, a man named Gregory Vaughan, adjusted his expensive watch and crossed his arms like he was the sheriff of some suburban kingdom. "See," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's refusing to cooperate again. We told him he's not allowed on that parcel. The board voted last month that section's reserved for HOA management." I laughed softly. "That parcel is my front yard, Greg." His smile twitched. "Not according to our zoning amendment." The younger officer shifted uneasily. He could tell something was off. "Mr. Harlan," he said, reading my name off a notepad, "maybe you should step back inside while we sort this out." I folded my arms. "You're standing on my property. If I step back, you'll say I retreated, and Greg here will claim ownership by silence. No. I'll stand right here." Greg exhaled dramatically. Typical. Always trying to make everything difficult. The other HOA members, 2 women and a balding man with a clipboard, nodded like a Greek chorus of pettiness. One of them muttered, "He's the one who didn't pay the assessment fee for landscaping." I turned my gaze toward her. "I didn't pay because I mow my own lawn. There's no clause saying I have to pay someone else to do what I already do." Greg stepped closer, smugness curdling into arrogance. "That's not your decision to make. You signed the HOA covenant. You follow the rules, or you face consequences. You've been a problem for us since last year's dispute." The memory flashed through my head, last year's dispute. The HOA had tried to charge every resident $3,000 for a community improvement fund. I'd asked for financial records. They refused. I'd written a formal letter citing the Homeowners Association Act, Section 720.303, the part that required transparency in financial management. They hated that I knew the law better than they did. But they had no idea how much better I knew it. The officer cleared his throat again. "Mr. Vaughan, this is a civil matter, not criminal. Trespassing laws are tricky when ownership's in question." Greg smiled wider. "We'll see about that." Then to me, "You've got 15 minutes to leave, or we'll press charges." I could feel the weight of every watching neighbor. The smell of wet grass and exhaust filled the air. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler clicked mechanically, oblivious to the drama. "I'm not leaving my home," I said quietly. Greg smirked. "Then we'll see you in court." That line would have sounded far more threatening if I hadn't heard it in my courtroom every week. The officers eventually left, looking more uncomfortable than convinced. They said they'd file a report and let the county review it. The HOA crowd lingered on the sidewalk, whispering. Greg gave me one last grin before walking off, his expensive shoes sinking slightly in the wet lawn. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the red taillights fading down the street. Then I went inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. My black robe hung over the chair in my study, the faint scent of courthouse coffee still clinging to it. My nameplate sat on the desk, Judge Michael Harlan, 9th District Court. I sank into the leather chair and let out a slow breath. They wanted a court case? Fine. They'd get one. But not in the way they expected. Later that night, I pulled out the HOA's bylaws, the ones I'd requested a copy of 6 months earlier. I read every page, every clause, every unconstitutional overreach they'd sneaked past the homeowners. I marked the sections that violated state statutes, the ones that gave them illegal authority over private property. Somewhere between Section 12 and Section 15, I found it, the smoking gun. The association reserves the right to enforce property access restrictions, including reclassification of parcels under common ground use, without compensation to the homeowner. Illegal. Completely unenforceable. But they didn't know that, yet. I smiled for the first time that night. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early. The air smelled like paper and disinfectant, the smell of quiet power. My clerk, Karen, greeted me with her usual brisk efficiency. "Morning, Judge. You've got a new civil docket added for Friday, something about a property injunction." "Let me guess," I said. "HOA of Ridgeview Estates versus Michael Harlan." She blinked. "How did you?" "Lucky guess. I spent the day presiding over small claims, car accidents, landlord disputes, the usual noise of people trying to outlogic one another. But every now and then, between cases, my mind drifted back to Greg's smug face, to the flashing lights outside my house, to the laughter behind those blinds. I could have easily recused myself from the case. I could have let another judge handle it. But part of me, the part that still believed in justice as something more than paperwork, wanted to see this through. Not for revenge. For principle. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the courthouse, I stood by my office window watching the parking lot empty. The reflection in the glass showed a man who looked tired but not broken. They'd tried to make a criminal out of me on my own land. They'd forgotten one thing. The law wasn't their weapon. It was mine. And soon, they'd learn the difference between rules written on paper and justice carved in stone. The courthouse lobby was unusually busy that morning. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, the kind of cold white that drains color from everything, faces, clothes, even hope. I stood in line like everyone else, waiting to go through the metal detector. No robe. No title. Just another man in a charcoal suit and a calm expression. The woman behind me complained about the line. "Judges ought to make this faster," she said. I smiled faintly. "They try." The clerk at the security station didn't recognize me. I was fine with that. Today, I didn't come as Judge Harlan. Today, I came as the man they tried to humiliate. In courtroom 4B, the case of Ridgeview Estates HOA versus Michael Harlan was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Gregory Vaughan and his entourage were already there when I walked in. They had dressed for war, matching navy blazers, shiny name tags, thick binders full of papers that probably looked impressive until you actually read them. Their attorney, a man named Carl Denning, was the type who valued volume over logic. His tie was too bright, his cufflinks too loud, and his smirk just rehearsed enough to be irritating. When he saw me, he leaned toward Greg. "That's him." Greg nodded, whispering something I couldn't hear. I took a seat quietly in the back row. The bailiff hadn't called the docket yet, and I wanted to see how they behaved when they thought I was just another defendant. Denning strutted toward the clerk's table and dropped his binder with a dramatic thump. "We're ready for proceedings," he announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Greg followed, exhaling like a man who'd already won. The bailiff finally entered. "All rise for the honorable judge." But before he could finish, the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Karen Morales stepped out. She was a colleague of mine, sharp, no-nonsense, the kind who saw through performance in seconds. She glanced over her docket. "Ridgeview Estates HOA versus Michael Harlan," she said, voice calm but firm. "Parties present." Denning puffed out his chest. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiffs, Ridgeview HOA, are represented by myself, Attorney Carl Denning, and HOA President Gregory Vaughan." Her eyes shifted toward me. "And the defendant?" I stood. "Michael Harlan, Your Honor." She blinked once, recognition flickering for the briefest second, but she kept her composure. "Mr. Harlan," she said evenly, "good morning." "Good morning, Judge Morales." If Greg noticed the faint familiarity between us, he didn't show it. Denning launched straight into his opening statement, waving his arms like a conductor of chaos. "Your Honor, This individual has repeatedly violated HOA guidelines, ignored board rulings, and occupied property now designated as community-managed land. The association has made every attempt to resolve this amicably, but Mr. Harlan refuses to comply with the rules he agreed to when purchasing his home. He placed a stack of papers on the evidence table with a self-satisfied grin. Judge Morales glanced at the stack, then at me. Mr. Harlan, your response. I stood slowly, straightening my tie. Your Honor, my response is simple: that document is void. The HOA's reclassification of private property into community land violates Section 720.3075 of the State Homeowners Association Act and several constitutional property rights protections. Denning snorted. Your Honor, with respect, the defendant is misinterpreting. I continued, ignoring him. Furthermore, they attempted to enforce this illegal amendment through threats, intimidation, and, most recently, a false criminal trespass complaint. I have photographic, financial, and written evidence proving their abuse of power. Judge Morales raised an eyebrow. You have evidence with you? I nodded. All properly documented and indexed. I handed a small folder to the bailiff. Unlike Denning's mountain of paper, mine was clean, minimal, surgical. Greg leaned forward, whispering fiercely to Denning. The lawyer frowned, flipped through his binder, and whispered back. They were already losing their rhythm. Judge Morales skimmed the first few pages. Her brows lifted slightly. Mr. Denning, she said, your client's reclassification documents are unsigned by the county registrar. Denning hesitated. Well, that's an administrative delay, Your Honor. An illegal one, I said calmly. Greg slammed his hand on the table. You can't talk to the court like that. I turned to him, my voice steady. I've been talking to courts for 15 years, Mr. Vaughn. I know exactly how to address one. The color drained from his face. Denning blinked. Wait, 15 years? Judge Morales gave me a warning glance, not for discipline, but for effect. Mr. Harlan, please refrain from editorializing. Of course, Your Honor, I said smoothly. My apologies. Denning scrambled to recover. Your Honor, even if the defendant believes our paperwork is flawed, he still agreed to HOA governance when he purchased his home. I smiled faintly. True. But that governance is limited by law, not by the whims of a committee drunk on power. Objection. Denning barked. Overruled, Judge Morales said instantly. The courtroom chuckled quietly. For the next 30 minutes, Denning tried to twist the narrative, citing irrelevant precedents and half-read clauses. I counted each one with the exact statute number, subsection, and case precedent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show anger. By the time he reached page 5 of his notes, sweat had started to bead on his forehead. Greg leaned toward him, whispering urgently. I caught fragments. Why does he know this much? Who is this guy? Judge Morales cleared her throat. Mr. Denning, unless you can produce properly recorded documentation proving your client's authority to alter property boundaries, I see no grounds for an injunction. Denning's voice cracked. Your Honor, with respect, the defendant is making a mockery of this process. I met his gaze, calm as a quiet sea. No, Counselor. I'm respecting it more than you realize. The hearing adjourned at noon. Judge Morales said she'd review the filings and reconvene next week for a formal ruling. As people packed their bags, I turned to leave, but Greg stormed up beside me, his face red. You think you're clever, don't you? You just wait, when we file the civil appeal, you'll regret crossing us. I paused by the door and looked at him. You already filed it, Greg. He blinked. What? The HOA's civil complaint. You sent it 2 weeks ago to District Court Division 3, my division. For a heartbeat, silence. Then I smiled, not cruelly, but coldly, like truth itself. You'll get your appeal, Mr. Vaughn, I said softly. But this time, I'll be the one hearing it. Greg's mouth fell open. Denning turned pale. The realization spread across their faces like a storm cloud. I left them standing there, two men who thought they could manipulate the law, finally understanding what it means to stand before it. The day of the appeal arrived cloaked in irony. The same HOA that had called the police on me for trespassing was now lined up outside my courtroom, the one where I'd passed sentence on real criminals, fraudsters, and con artists for over a decade. And now, three people in pressed suits, with smug smiles and shaky confidence, were about to discover how different real justice feels compared to their little neighborhood meetings. Courtroom 3C smelled like varnish and nerves. The walls were lined with portraits of past judges, stern faces painted in oil, watching like silent witnesses. The seal of the state gleamed above the bench. My bench. I entered through the side door, robe flowing, gavel in hand. The bailiff's voice rang out with practiced authority. All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Harlan. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Gregory Vaughan froze halfway to his seat. His attorney, Denning, nearly dropped his briefcase. The room rustled with whispers from curious onlookers, reporters, other attorneys, and a few neighbors who'd come to watch the spectacle they'd heard rumors about. I took my seat. Be seated. The sound of chairs scraping against the tile echoed like a confession. Greg's face was a picture of disbelief. Why, you can't be serious, he stammered. This has to be a conflict of interest. You're the defendant. I folded my hands neatly over the bench. Mr. Vaughan, as the record shows, your appeal was filed in my division by your own attorney. You had full opportunity to request a reassignment. You didn't. The docket stands. Denning jumped up, face flushed. Your Honor, we weren't aware of. You weren't aware of the judge assigned to your own case. I cut in smoothly. That's surprising, Mr. Denning. For a man who bills $600 an hour, I'd expect better attention to detail. Laughter rippled through the gallery. Denning turned crimson. I let the silence hang a few seconds longer, then said evenly, let's proceed. The clerk began reading the case summary aloud. Ridgeview Estates Homeowners Association vs. Michael Harlan, appeal of circuit court dismissal regarding property reclassification and alleged trespassing. As she read, I studied Greg. His confidence had drained away, replaced by something new, a faint, twitching anger trying to disguise fear. When she finished, I spoke. Mr. Denning, since this is your client's appeal, you may begin. He stood reluctantly. Your Honor, with all due respect, this situation presents. Counselor, I interrupted, I said you may begin your argument, not your excuses. A nervous chuckle from the audience. He swallowed hard and opened his binder. The HOA believes the lower court misinterpreted our governing documents. We maintain that. Stop. He froze. I leaned forward slightly. The HOA believes? Or do you have evidence that the court erred in its interpretation? Denning stammered, flipping pages like a drowning man searching for air. We have supporting documentation from the association's bylaws that grant authority. I raised a hand. You mean the same bylaws already? Found invalid by statute section 720.3075, the section you ignored last time. The courtroom murmured. Denning's voice broke. Your Honor, I set the gavel down with a deliberate thud. The law isn't a suggestion, Counselor. It's not something you get to reinvent because you lost a vote at a neighborhood meeting. Greg shot up from his chair, voice shaking with fury. This is outrageous. You're biased. You're sitting there pretending to be impartial after we called the police on you. I looked at him calmly. Pretending. I repeated softly. Let me explain something, Mr. Vaughan. The room fell silent. When I put on this robe, I am not a neighbor, or a homeowner, or a man you tried to embarrass in front of a crowd. I am the law as it applies in this courtroom, the same law that protects you, and the same one you abused. You thought you could twist it because you held a clipboard and a vote. But here, Mr. Vaughan, you're not the president of anything. His face reddened. His attorney tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically for him to sit down. But Greg couldn't help himself. "You're trying to humiliate me." I cut him off sharply. "No, Mr. Vaughn. You did that to yourself when you tried to weaponize power you didn't understand." I turned to the clerk. "Read into the record Exhibit C, the HOA's reclassification memo." She flipped a page and began reading. The memo contained the clause that had caused the entire mess, the illegal redefinition of my yard as community-maintained property. When she reached the part stating that the HOA reserves the right to enforce compliance through fines, citations, and removal, I raised my hand. "Stop there," I said. Then I faced the courtroom. "That sentence, ladies and gentlemen, is unlawful under both state statute and federal housing protections. The HOA's leadership knowingly attempted to seize property they did not own. They also filed a false police report, misrepresenting ownership of land they had no claim to." Denning tried to object, but I spoke over him. "And when challenged, they doubled down, abusing process, wasting judicial time, and slandering a homeowner in public." I paused, letting the words hang like heavy stones. Greg's hands trembled. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Mr. Vaughn," I said finally, voice quiet but razor-sharp, "you called me a trespasser in my own yard. You sent officers to arrest me in front of my neighbors. You humiliated my name. So tell me, how does it feel, sitting here now, realizing the only person who can decide your fate is the same man you tried to destroy?" He swallowed, eyes flickering between rage and shame. You can't." "I already did," I said softly. "Now sit down." By the time closing arguments came, Denning had given up trying to sound confident. His voice quivered through empty legal jargon while Greg sat rigid, face pale. When it was my turn, I removed my glasses and looked straight at them. "This case," I began, "isn't about a boundary line or a bylaw. It's about arrogance, the kind that grows when people mistake authority for ownership. You thought paperwork could outweigh principle, that a committee could play king over the Constitution." I leaned forward. "You forgot one thing, the law is not your toy." The gallery was silent, hanging on every word. I struck the gavel once, sharp and final. "This court finds that the Ridgeview Estates Homeowners Association acted unlawfully in its attempt to reclassify private property. All HOA actions and penalties related to that reclassification are hereby vacated. Furthermore, the court recommends state review of the association's leadership for misuse of authority and fraudulent filings." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Greg's head dropped into his hands. Denning stared blankly, as if hoping he'd misheard. I continued, voice steady. "This case is closed. And Mr. Vaughn." He looked up slowly. "Consider this your warning. Power without principle will always collapse. You just learned that the hard way." The gavel struck again. Case dismissed. As I rose from the bench, the room stayed silent. The bailiff called adjournment, and people slowly began to file out. Reporters whispered into their phones. Greg didn't move. His attorney touched his arm, but he just sat there, hollow-eyed, staring at the floor. I stepped down from the bench, walked past him, and paused just long enough to say quietly, "You tried to use the law to hurt people, Greg. Remember what it felt like when it finally looked back at you." Then I walked out, the echo of my footsteps the only sound left in the courtroom. The news broke within hours. By evening, my courtroom had become the center of every local broadcast. The headlines were merciless and gleeful. Judge rules against HOA that tried to arrest him. When power meets the bench, a homeowner's revenge in court. HOA nightmare ends with a gavel. For once, the media got the story mostly right. But they didn't understand the part that mattered most. This wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about truth catching up to arrogance. The courthouse emptied slowly that day. I sat alone in my chambers, robe folded neatly over the chair, tie loosened, the clock ticking quietly. 4 years, I'd presided over other people's fights, families, neighbors, corporations, criminals, but this time, justice had sat on both sides of the bench. and it had burned hotter than I'd ever expected. Karen, my clerk, knocked softly before stepping inside. "They're all gone," she said. "Even the reporters. You want me to lock up?" I nodded. "Thanks, Karen." She hesitated. "You know, sir, I've worked with you 7 years. I've seen you angry, frustrated, disappointed, but I've never seen you that calm. It was scary, in a good way." I smiled faintly. Calm is just what happens when a storm finally ends. She left, closing the door behind her. A week later, I took a quiet walk through Ridgeview Estates. The neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, the tension gone. Homeowners who had once avoided me now waved from their porches. Some whispered thanks. Others just smiled awkwardly, embarrassed they'd ever believed the HOA's lies. I didn't blame them. Fear makes people small, power makes them forget who they are. Gregory Vaughan's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac. The HOA office sign that once hung proudly on his lawn was gone. So was the man himself. I'd heard he'd resigned from the board and put his home up for sale. His lawyer, Denning, had been sanctioned by the bar for filing fraudulent documents. Justice, I thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, steady, inevitable. Near my property line, the patch of grass where they'd once accused me of trespassing was green again. The police tape had long been removed. The earth bore no scars, just quiet resilience. I walked up the drive, remembering that night, the flashing lights, the smug faces, the humiliation. It felt like another lifetime now. The kind of story you tell someone else and they laugh, until they realize it really happened. Standing there, I heard a car pull up behind me. It was a dark sedan. The driver's door opened, and Gregory Vaughan stepped out. But he wasn't the same man who'd stood smirking behind the police that night. His posture was smaller, shoulders bent under something heavier than pride. "Judge Harlan," he said, his voice low. "Can I speak to you?" I turned slowly. "You can speak. I'm off the clock." He nodded, glancing down. "I came to apologize." Silence stretched between us. He swallowed. "I thought being in charge meant I had power. I thought if I controlled the rules, I could control people. But I didn't understand the law, not really. You did. And I tried to use it against you." He looked up, eyes raw. "I'm sorry for what I did. For the embarrassment. For everything." I studied him for a long moment. The part of me that remembered the shame, the anger, wanted to walk away. But another part, the part that had sworn an oath, understood what this moment really was. "You were wrong," I said finally. "But you learned. That's more than most people can say." He nodded slowly. "Are we done, then?" I extended my hand. "We're done." He hesitated, then shook it. The handshake wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was acknowledgement. A small, quiet closing of a long and bitter chapter. In the months that followed, Ridgeview changed. The HOA dissolved after a vote by the homeowners themselves. They replaced it with a community council, volunteer-run, transparent, accountable. The rules shrank from 50 pages to 3. No fines for tall grass. No arbitrary inspections. Just neighbors, finally acting like neighbors again. One evening, they invited me to the first community meeting. I didn't sit at the front. I sat near the back, listening. The discussions were civil, the tone warm. People laughed. Someone joked about naming the park Harlan Hill. I waved it off with a smile. "Just keep it honest," I said. "That's all the name it needs." They agreed. Later that night, I returned home and poured myself a small glass of bourbon. I stepped out onto the porch where the police had once stood. The moonlight washed across the lawn, silver and peaceful. The law can be cruel. It can be cold. But it can also be a mirror, one that shows people who they really are. I'd spent my career believing that justice was about punishment. That day, I learned it's really about balance, restoring what arrogance tries to break. I sipped the bourbon and listened to the wind move through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a dog barked. The world, it seemed, was finally back to normal. A month later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a plain white envelope. Inside was a single page. Thank you for reminding us that the law protects, not punishes, the residents of Ridgeview Estates. At the bottom, someone had drawn a small sketch of a gavel resting on a house. I folded the note and placed it in my desk drawer, right next to my father's old fountain pen and my oath of office. In the years that followed, I told this story only once, to a group of young law students. I wanted them to understand something they wouldn't find in any textbook. Justice, I told them, isn't about winning. It's about remembering that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs a place to stand. One student raised her hand. And what about the HOA? Did they ever come back? I smiled. No. But the lesson did, every time someone thought they were above the rules. They laughed softly, and I could see understanding in their eyes. That night, when I finally turned off the lights in my office and walked out into the quiet parking lot, I looked up at the courthouse dome glowing faintly against the stars. The law, my old companion, stood silent and steady as ever. And I thought of the irony one last time. They had tried to have me arrested. But in the end, they were the ones who learned what it truly means to be judged.